Well, Patreon supporters, welcome to our first Crowdcast of October 2020. With us here today is my erstwhile colleague at University of Colorado Nordic Studies, Avedan Raggio, who in fact has been teaching at the University of Colorado a really long time. How long?
Since 2011.
2011. I mean, that's a heck of a long experience teaching.
I've been the constant in the Nordic program for a good while.
Yeah, so tell us first. Tell us a little bit about your career, how you got into this, and what kind of things you teach at the University of Colorado.
Well, I did my my BA here at CU, getting BAs in classics and humanities with a focus on medieval studies and the crossover from antiquity into the Middle Ages. Took a couple years off to work, and then came back to CU to get a master's in classics with a focus on late Roman antiquity. I was going to TA for the woman who was teaching Vikings and Sagas here in 2011, but she got a job at University College London. So a week before the semester started, the chair asked me if I could teach Sagas, and I said, sure. But that went very well because I'd taken and I had kept good notes when I took the class as an undergraduate. So that worked out really well. And the skills that I'd learned as a classics major, as a classics master's student, as far as textual analysis and critical analysis, you can apply that to literature and societies in any age. So it was, while my content expertise that I was studying for my master's was classics and Roman, the skills translated pretty easily and well to medieval studies and the Viking Age Norse.
And you have a real love of the sagas too. Just from listening to you talk and from your classes and in some of your public talks, I mean, you clearly have a deep love for these as stories.
I really do. Yes, I really do. I started. Yes, I took the Sagas class as an undergraduate, and then when you're teaching, I think in as much as you're able to, you should learn as much as possible about pedagogy and also about the content. So reading more sagas, reading articles about sagas, especially about masculinity in sagas, is particularly interesting to me. And then I've been lucky enough to go to Iceland 5 times. Two times, here's an intersection of sagas and textiles. 2 times I went specifically to embroider on the the Njal Saga Tapestry in Kolsvöllur, Iceland, which they just finished a couple weeks ago.
Yep, I was pointing to those headlines when I announced this Crowdcast.
Yes, I'm so proud. I'm so thrilled. I'm very excited for them. I hope they find a place to display it soon.
Was there any specific scene or scenes that you worked on?
Oh, yes. In Njal Saga, I stitched Amundi the Blind. So let's see. This is chapter 106, I think, of Njal Saga, 106 or 107, where Amundi the Blind goes to Luting at the Althing to get compensation for his father, Hoskuld Njalsson's killing. And Luting says, no, I paid compensation, go away. So Asmundi calls to God, if God gave me the ability, I would get vengeance now. God grants him his sight. Amundi kills Luting and he goes blind again.
The first miracle in Iceland.
But so interesting because like the miracles about meekness or about piety, like that I don't think that would really jive with the Viking Age Icelanders, but this is a god that facilitates the ethos of revenge. That's something that I think the medieval Icelanders could really get behind.
Who you pray to changed. What you pray for doesn't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I did that scene. I did when the Njalssons and Asgrim are looking for support at the Althing right after the killing of Hoskuld Thrainson. And I stitched a couple flames of the burning.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's I mean, what a cool thing to contribute to. Would you say Njal Saga is your favorite saga to teach, or is there a different one?
Gisli Saga is probably my favorite one to teach because of all the sexual humor and insults.
I like Gisli's too. Mm-hmm. It's also a great one for students to have fairly early in a sagas class, I feel like, because there's not 80 characters to keep track of. It's a more straightforward saga that way.
Yes.
Martha asks if you could show your hand knit shawl.
Oh, certainly. One moment.
You want to do some show and tell for us here for a moment?
So the first semester of my master's program, I spun and knit. Spun and knit Cheryl Oberle's Irish fur shawl. So this
very
is
nice.
alpaca and wool and angora, and it's enormous. So there's that.
Very nice.
Also, textile adjacent is a Swedish art. This is pronounce it a shinfel, and it's basically you're stitching Tetris with irregularly shaped sheepskins to make squares, and then with 6 or 8, you can make like an actual rectangle, and that was the blanket. The heron hide was the blanket for a family.
Oh, that's very pretty.
We got the Ernest dragons or lions.
Yeah, I was going to say it kind of reminded me of the Ernest Stave Church.
Yes.
Wow, that's really cool. Did you get the alpaca from up that place at Netherlands?
No, all the fleeces. I did everything except shear the sheep, because even in Boulder, they won't let you have sheep as pets. But I got all the fleeces at the Estes Park Wool Market.
Okay.
Which is a big event if you're a textile nerd. Second weekend of June every year.
That's also around when Estes Park has another unique event, which is like the world champion like knife fighting thing. So Estes Park is a fascinating town. All right. Well, we've got one question here I'll kick off with from someone who couldn't be here. Josh DeFore asked, did tapestries serve solely as cultural or artistic items, or were there practical uses for them, such as providing some insulation to the wall they were hung on? And yes. People feel free to add questions, and I'll try to get to them roughly in order you ask them.
Yes, they would have served a practical purpose as well. Although I sort of, in subsistence societies, I find it, I sort of imagine that everything has to have some practical purpose unless you are extremely wealthy. But yes, the tapestries would have had artistic merit, and they would have provided work for people to do. But also, yes, they kept things warm.
Of course. hence the very material in which they're sewn. He also asks as a follow-up to that, would any person be able to look at a tapestry and discern the general meaning? I.e., would a common figure such as Thor have a more or less stylized appearance from one weaver to another, such that someone seeing it for the first time could read the tapestry accurately without it being explained to them?
That's a really good question. I wish that I had, I don't have a very specific answer, but I'll give you what I have, which is that I haven't studied the content of the tapestries so much as I've studied how they were made and like how you got from sheep to tapestry. I would assume that the source society, so the person who makes the tapestry for their contemporaries, they understand the symbolism, and therefore the people around them, the intended audience for the tapestry, they would also understand the symbolism. So in the same way that we can recognize that Garfield is a cartoon, and we can look at different television programs, for example, and we can discern this one is meant to be taken seriously, this one is meant to be satire. We're almost intuitively familiar with how to interpret different bits of visual art. I think that would have been the same in the Viking Age as well. So people who were part of the society of the person who made the tapestry would understand the language of it. But change that a couple hundred years or come from a different region, the dialect of the symbols might be a bit different.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think about Norse art more generally, where even in fairly small pictures, you can usually tell who's supposed to be like a high status woman because they'll have that hairstyle with a knot like halfway down.
Yes.
Right. Or I think about where Thor, for example, on at least one runic inscription, or one inscription, I guess is not actually runes on it that comes to mind. Like he's got a little hammer to kind of show you who it is, even though he's just a little tiny, humanoid figure. Yeah, so there'd probably be, I would think, shorthands like that. On nail letter, was there kind of a general consensus about what different people ought to look like?
Yes. So Njal, of course, was beardless, the only male figure who was beardless, and the repeat characters. So Gunnar, Kari Solmundarson, and Skarpheden, they all had a look. And the color palette for the tapestry was 8 colors, so all stitched with Icelandic wool, all dyed, with the exception of the blues, the indigos, all dyed with native Icelandic plants.
Wow.
So a limited color palette, but it's so readable. It is absolutely amazing. And they had 2 entwined turtle doves that symbolized a marriage. And in tapestry, there would be the main register, and then a smaller upper and lower register. So main events would happen in the middle, but then you'd have a little turtle dove up top. That means someone's gotten married.
Huh. That's cool. How did you indicate that Almundi was blind? Did you put sunglasses on him, or?
No, I love that idea though. No, it was just slits for eyes underneath his eyebrows, and then open eyes when his side was given.
Oh, that's cool.
And we sort of had one arm out, like he was groping, going into the booth.
It's okay. Yeah, no, it's a good visual shorthand.
Yes, and also the outline of a bag of money with a cross, an X across it, and then after Luting is killed, there's the bag of money compensation without the X. So Almundi came in, no compensation, kills Luting, Almundi leaves blind again, but with compensation.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's good visual shorthand.
It's so great. I hope they do like a film of it or a movie just going along like they've done with the Bayeux tapestry.
That would be cool.
And my students have been able to recognize scenes from it, which is amazing.
Oh, of course. I mean, Njal Saga is a really visually compelling story, the way that it's told, right? I mean, that it's I would think a fairly rich experience to try to translate it into that kind of visual medium. I think it's a cool project. We have some questions starting to flow over on the side here. Lorian asked, because they're textiles, are they hard to find from the Old Norse era?
Yes, unfortunately, yeah. The soil conditions and the preservation conditions have to be very specific for organic matter like textiles and wool to survive. In the Icelandic National Museum, they have some fragments of textiles, and I would love to handle them and look at them closer, but I just had to press my nose really hard against the glass to try and see whether they were Z-spun or S-spun, singles or plied, what type of twill it was. They've got some, let's see, they also had some examples of where they have the weaving, but they've also woven in tufts of locks of wool to make sort of a shaggy coat. So the fragments, what survives tends to be fragments, and it's difficult without chemistry, without science, to determine the original color and so on.
I was trying to think of what tapestries survive from the Old Norse period. There's the Oseberg tapestry found with the Oseberg ship.
The Overhugdal.
Overhugdal,
I was pronouncing that. There are fragments of tablet woven bands, which is a whole other amazing thing. And then fragments of null binding, which is you're making knots and fabric.
And how much of that comes from Greenland? Because I know Greenland is kind of an icebox for in terms of preservation. I know sometimes textiles have preserved better there.
I don't know. I've only looked at I've only had to look at the Icelandic textiles that have been on display, but it would make sense that Greenland would have a greater record, but I don't know anything about that, I'm afraid.
Sure. Let's see, Ricardo asked, the dialect, the symbols may be different, but it doesn't take longer periods of time for the message and images to change.
I don't know if we have enough examples of the symbols and tapestries over time to say. I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but we don't have enough data to say more about it.
Right. We can speculate about how fast or slow things might have changed, but if we only have material it's 100 years apart.
And we might assume that it would follow what you see in tapestries and fiber arts would follow the same trajectory, change at the same rate as what we see in non-tapestry, non-textile art. But that's an assumption that we're making.
Right. That makes sense, though. We have to work with what we got. Payson asks, do you know anything about the processes used to set the dyes for tapestry?
Well, indigo is easy because the mordant for indigo is oxygen. For the other dyes, I don't know, and that's because I've intentionally once I feel like I've done my time doing natural dyeing, and now I'm going to do the easy acid dyes because there's so much more predictable and easy in my own textile work. Alum, the mordants that set the dye into the fabric. They're often metals, and I don't remember what the Viking Age Norse used.
Interesting. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about how colors are made, but I assume that it's actually fairly complex. I was trying to remember why blue was so expensive, and it was because it was somehow really difficult to get or make or something.
Yes, there wasn't a native Icelandic source of blue, so they might have imported woad from England or indigo from farther abroad. It's a lot of trial and error because if you're using like dry leaves or moss or lichen or seaweed, the color of the object doesn't necessarily reflect the color that wool dyed with it will give you. So it's a lot of back and forth. Let's say they used madder, they used aspen.
Aspen.
Maybe birch. I may be thinking about it may be a translation problem. Birch. I'm trying to remember the wool that I brought home was labeled, but I'm not remembering specifics now.
Is it from the what's it called? The bowls that wasps make in the tree?
No, it's from the leaves.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
So it's not like iron gall. It's
sure.
Just the leaves.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I'm thinking about ink. Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's see. Lorian asks. Oh no, hold on. Robin asks, how are tapestries dated, and how accurate are the dates?
As sort of as accurate as anything else in archaeology, we can look. So similar to paleography, which is looking at the history of writing, we can sometimes look at particular stitches and date them the same way we would look at particular letters and scripts in paleography. A lot of it is relative dating. How do we date the items that were close to? How do we date the items that were buried close to this textile? I don't know how frequently carbon dating is used, but if that's an option, I assume that they would use it. And you might be able to look at, like if you find a textile and you're not sure of the provenance, you could compare it to other textiles and see if they're the same stitches, the same iconography, and you could try to date them that way. But it's going to be a range of things, and it's going to be maybe.
So you're kind of triangulating from different lines of evidence.
Yeah. That's
fascinating, though, that the actual stitches that an individual makes change over time.
I may be overstating it. So not the stitches an individual would use, but the style of stitching in a particular place, the style of finishing. I'm always kind of irritated because at museums they show one side of the tapestry, but they don't show the back. And the back of any textile work is just as interesting as the front.
Right. If you actually know what to look for in terms of how it's made.
Yeah.
Cool.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's you at museums, you see the beautiful things, but they frown if you sort of tug it and put a mirror and a light back there. So,
actually, speaking of that, would you recommend any particular reading to kind of get a starter on the subject of historic textiles and tapestries?
Viking clothing. I would think that's the title of the book. Viking clothing. Books, any books on Icelandic women. There we go. Books that talk about Viking Age women are going to talk about textiles because textiles was women's work. That's where I would suggest you start. And then from there, look at the bibliographies and scour for particular articles that interest you.
Okay, so like the recent one by Johanna Ketchner for the Shooter.
Absolutely.
Let's take a question from people who sent them in earlier. Josh DeFore asked another one. He asked, would most people have been more likely to be exposed to tapestries or to sagas as a form of cultural transmission? If someone rich enough to commission such a work wished to disseminate a story, would they have been more likely to hire someone to make a tapestry or perform a saga? Curious question.
That's a really cool question, and I have no idea. I have to assume that I would think that that having someone perform a saga would be more what's the word? More approachable. But yeah, I don't know. What a great question. I really wish I could think of a way to accurately answer it.
Well, it's saying in sagas, we actually have people both making tapestries and performing sagas. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a performance of a saga in a saga. So
very meta.
Yeah. Which one is that? Is that it's in the Sterlinger collection.
Okay. It's been a long time since I've read those.
Yeah, it's one of those roughly contemporary sagas, but someone performs a saga at an event. Mm-hmm. So clearly it is used as a kind of entertainment that way. You would think, it depends on what you think about saga origins, but you would think that sagas could generate semi-spontaneously. Right. I mean, it depends on what you call a saga too, right? Is it a saga when I tell you a stupid story about what happened to me? I mean, technically in Icelandic, that is a saga. Right.
I imagine it's a lot like folklore. Some of it is conversational, like, oh, this thing that happens reminds me of that time Scarpaden skated across the Raggio River.
Sure.
So you might tell bits and pieces of it, but the long form saga, the entire story, might only have been performed on special occasions over several days, or only written down at one point or so. But the story, bits of the story, would have been told here and there.
Sure. And then tapestries. I mean, we have sagas. Of course, very often women are working on sewing one thing or another, but tapestries in particular come up, for example, in Volsungs, where both Brynhildur and Gudrun at different times are working on tapestries.
Yes. And I'm curious about this. Because a tapestry is one thing, but when we talk about the Bio tapestry and even the Njal Saga tapestry, that's not actually tapestry. Tapestry is a technique of weaving. What we see in Bio and in the Njal Saga tapestry, that is embroidery. So embroidery is surface work, textile is structure. It's sort of like the difference between painting and fresco. That fresco has the pigment in the actual platter. Be gentle, art historians. As opposed to just being surface design. So I wonder, it kind of reminds me of, like, in fairy tales, oh, she had a golden spinning wheel. Like, that is completely non-functional. No one who spins would want a golden spinning wheel. So if the word in Old Norse is correctly translated as tapestry, then is that an example of a man, someone who didn't know the work, just saying, oh, it's a cloth that has pretty pictures. It's all the same.
That's an interesting point. Because the same thing comes up in discussing things like navigation, where people get frustrated because they say, how do they navigate? And well, the people doing the navigating are probably not the people writing the sagas, right? And so they may not actually even understand how this stuff is done, the same way you or I can ride in a plane without knowing how to build a plane. Right. That's the big point. And it also raises I mean, now I'm on the spot because I'm trying to think about what word is actually used there, and it would take me too long to dig around and find that. I know one word that occurs in the Poetic Edda, for example, in the poem Atlakvíða is guðvev, which is almost like battle weave.
Okay. That which makes me think of Daradarjot.
Right. But it occurs like in Atlakvíða in one stanza where we hear someone or something gnir undir guðvevum, I think. So like whines or complains under the tapestries. I think it's when Atli's about to die. But, that could also just, the guth part there could just be for alliteration. But I guess that could also be maybe potentially an early term for like a tapestry that depicted some scene of war. And of course we do see scenes of battle talked about in the sagas, but are any tapestries or embroideries, I guess I ought to use the term. Do we have any that depict fighting?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Because both the Oseberg and the Overhugdal I mean, the Oseberg has people kind of like walking in what seems like it could be kind of an almost religious context, right? I think the Overhook doll is something kind of similar.
Yes. But there's so many different interpretations for Overhookdal.
Yeah.
It's sort of, yeah, it's frustrating, but it's also really interesting and exciting. Yes, I can't. The textiles, aside from the two that we've mentioned, the Osberg and the Overhookdal, at the National Museum in Iceland, they have liturgical garments, so church vestments that have figures in them. And I think I decided, face pressed up against the glass, that those were done with tablet weaving, which is not quite tapestry and is not embroidery either.
Okay, so this
tablet weaving is a whole other thing. I took a 3-day long class to figure that out, and I'm still at the basics with it. So it's magic, it's wizardry.
The stuff is immensely more complicated than I realized.
As well, what isn't when you start to look at it?
Right. Yeah. The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. Ricardo asks, is there any historic tapestry you would love to study?
Honestly, any of them. Just to no, I don't have any particular in mind, but I'd love to get my very clean gloved hands on any of the textiles to see if I could determine how I might recreate them, because this historical recreation is really interesting, and there are some common knowledge with spinning and weaving today that seems to fly in the face of what I see in the artifacts. For example, I remember being taught that weaving with singles. So when you're spinning yarn, you take wool, you add twist. If you have two bits of wool that are twisted the same way, they will. There's a lot of potential energy that is spun one way in each bit of wool. So if you put them against each other, they will twist the other way. The potential energy will balance out, and you have a balanced yarn. Stella, there may be a cute infographic on plying that may be of assistance here. But I remember always being taught that weaving with singles yarn, with unplied yarn, was hazardous because singles were really fragile. So then I thought, okay, if people in ye olden days are going to be making things for sales, making things that need to be really rugged and durable, they must not be using singles. But all we see are singles yarn being woven. So that made me, all right, I've got to rethink my assumption, rethink this thing that I've been told. Maybe how did they weave with singles so that they didn't just abrade during the weaving? And how did it, and gosh, I'm so amazed at how they did all of this with warp weighted looms. I've made model warp weighted looms and tried to weave with them, and just, nope, I've got my floor loom that is so much easier. I will be grateful that the technology has progressed. All right, so I was talking about tapestries that I would like to work on. I'd be really, really pleased to look at any of them.
This, what this actually reminds me of, sort of meta culturally, is mountain man recreationists today. This is a big thing in Wyoming, maybe not anywhere else, but people who go out with like black powder firearms and have clothes that are stitched the way they would be in 1830 or something, right? It's like part of you come to understand the earlier culture by kind of inhabiting things the way and doing things the way they did them, and realizing what they thought of as the process, right?
Yes. I love that stuff. In fact, I realize now, this was about probably 10 years ago that I did this. I realize now what my methodology was, but it's still a fun just example. I wanted to make a Viking style cloak, and I was still figuring out what that meant, but I kept track of how long it would take for me to make a cloak. So I did. So 90 hours later, I had my cloak. And then I was trying to figure out a few years later what the relative worth of a slave was in Jarl Saga, because they quote 12 ounces of silver for the 2 slaves killed with Bergthor and Helgerd's feud. Well, how much is that in today's money? So I thought, I found the figures. So 12 ounces of silver is so many units, so many yards of Vavmal, so many L's of this semi-standard woven cloth. Okay, well, if the square footage of my cloak is equal to 7 units of Vodmal, how many ounces of silver is that, and so on. Uh, and then I tried to figure, okay, well, this was 90 hours of work. How many? Um, what's the minimum wage? But again, lots of methodology problems because the Vikings didn't have minimum wage. They valued time differently.
Right.
I was using different tools. I'm a much better spinner and weaver now than I was 10 years ago, so I would presumably be faster.
This would be interesting stuff to talk to or hear the opinion of William Ian Miller about.
Yeah.
He thinks so much about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've actually thought about emailing him, but then got
Oh, he's a
shy.
nice guy.
So.
He's a nice guy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he'd get back to you. Ricardo also asks, are you aware of Anne McCaffrey's books, Dragon Riders of Pern? Because she had Tapestry's very important element in the plot.
I read a couple of those books when I was years ago when I was younger, but I'll have to revisit them.
Okay, yeah, I haven't ever read them. Not a fantasy person. That's why we've got you here today. Stella, by the way, Stella reminded me, Stella's a person you would have seen at Norse Poetry Nights with the Mohawk.
Okay.
So I think you have met.
Yeah.
Stella asks, this question may be going a little off topic since it's not about textile or tapestry production specifically, but while spinning or textile crafts don't seem to be the major metaphor for how the Norns create fate, especially in Volsball where they specifically carve, there are some stories in the sagas where spinning seems to be connected to magical acts, or weaving, or possibly twining, plying. Do you have any thoughts on this sort of craft possibly being connected to Norse magical practices, or am I too far off topic?
I don't. No, I think you're onto something. Let's see. There's a book called Women's Work, The Last 20,000 Years. I think the author's last name is Barber. But she talks about the overlap between women's work and women's magic, and this really cool symbolism of when you're making string, when you're making yarn, you're taking chaos, just disorganized wool, and you're making into it something that has order, that has life, that keeps you warm, right? Enables you to sail. Like so, she linked the act of creating a child to the act of creating life, which is something women can do, to the creation of textiles, which is something that women did. As an animist, I think there's a lot to be said. Yes, doing textiles, weaving things together, taking the chaos of wool, just random wool, and making it into something orderly, something balanced, and then creating something further with that. It makes intuitive sense that would work magically. And although I'm not aware that we have sources for the Viking Age Norse with this type of magic, it makes sense to me that if it's intuitive to me, it seems like it would be intuitive to people 1,000 years ago as well. I don't think that would stand up in any academic setting, but it feels right.
Well, and yeah, the association of creation by means that the people who are actually recording literarily, which is mostly men, don't really understand. I mean, in the same way, they don't necessarily understand how exactly childbirth happens, right? Yeah, I can kind of see that. That actually ties in a little bit with something, with a point that my friend Dr. Luke Gordon, who teaches at the University of New Mexico, makes about ancient magic, and how often it's associated with women. Is that the men are the ones who are writing the stories? They don't necessarily understand how women do anything they do. Right? So it all kind of ends up being this sort of vaguely like other process.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat. Spinning Sailor is great. Yep.
Oh, by Elder Heidemann. Runvig asks, were black textiles a thing in the Viking Age? People love to point out that black is difficult to achieve using natural dyes, but on the other hand, black sheep exist.
Yes, and certainly there's a lot of color variety in the Icelandic sheep. Certainly lots of black sheep there. So I wouldn't think that they would need to dye their textiles black. They had the black wool. The need to dye wool colors, especially black, is, as far as I know, it's more of a modern thing because sheep have been selectively bred, especially wool sheep, selectively bred to have only white wool. That's why being the black sheep of the family, the black sheep was a bad thing because you didn't want the black sheep to be hopping in with the white sheep and making white, not perfectly uniform white sheep. But the Icelandic breed of sheep has, I don't know, there's still so much diversity. I'm looking at my poster of sheep colors in Iceland, actually, like you do.
It's useful.
Yes, it is.
I think they have a horse one too.
The variety of colors in Icelandic sheep and Icelandic horses are just amazing. So they had black sheep in the Middle Ages. Then they still have them today. So I don't think that dyeing black would have been problematic.
I'll point out too. This is part of one of my hobby horses. Is that Svartur black and Blor blue are different. Everybody's for a couple decades been translating them both as black, but there's a social difference between wearing Svartur clothes, which is usually a poor person, right, and probably implies a natural black color maybe in the wool, versus Blor, which probably does mean blue and is actually higher status, right? You wear your blue clothes when you're showing off or when you're doing something kind of high profile in public.
So Gunnar would wear blue. Yeah,
he does, as far as I recall. Right, but yes. Wearing black or brown or gray, which are all natural sheep colors, is that's poor.
And if you're looking for a true black, that might be like if you just had a bunch of dark-haired sheep or dark-colored sheep, you blend that together, it's black from a distance, but when you look at it closer, more closely, it's brown or so on. It's a mix. Whereas something that is more expensive may have been more uniformly dyed.
That's a good point. Sure. Yeah, in fact, it's noticeable that in the Sagas, so often an indication of somebody of high status is somebody who's wearing litsklæði, right, colored clothes, right, probably implying artificially colored clothes. That's an interesting point. Phoenix asks, kind of, I guess, switching toward Tolkien for a moment here. Curious if you've seen the 2019 biographical Tolkien film and what you thought about it, if so.
No, I haven't yet. It's on the list, but I haven't seen it yet.
So this is the one where they add in Legolas at some point, right? Like The Hobbit.
Yes, let's just have random characters to make it into 3 movies.
Yeah. Although I do think they did add some fantasy stuff from what I recall. I don't know. I see so few movies. Also, Lexi asks if you've been involved in the Tolkien Tapestries in Aubasson.
No, this is the first time hearing about it. I'm very excited to learn more.
Okay.
Make a note about it. I think it's a great way to tell stories. I want there to be tapestries for everything.
I'm trying. The first thing that occurs to me, of course, is like my own life, and I'm thinking like, I don't know if I want anybody sewing some of that. Let's see, Rodman asked, were there any tapestry weaving master workshops in medieval Scandinavia that did commissioned work for large projects, for example, noble residences or cathedrals?
I don't know. It's a very unsatisfying answer, but I don't know. Good question.
I mean, it's a similar question, right, to like rune stones. We don't know, although there's maybe some indication that there were like masters and maybe workshops that taught particular schools. I would assume maybe something similar with textiles. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you another one that was sent to me beforehand. This is another one from Joshua Ford. I presume a great deal of these items have not survived until the present day. But do we have an idea of how many were lost or have historical references to tapestries that definitely or likely existed in the past but are now lost?
Yeah, there's not a lot of mention of them. I kind of like to think that it's one of those, the tapestries were sort of ubiquitous and the sort of thing that you don't mention them in a saga unless they're really special or plot relevant because they were just everywhere. Like we assume that if we're going into a home, there's going to be art on the wall, but unless it's something really notable, we don't specifically talk about the art on the wall. It's just a given. Yeah, there's going to be decoration. Yes, you're going to be wearing wool. Yes, there's going to be, if you can afford it, you're going to have wool rugs and wool tapestries, keeping the place warmer and livening it up a bit. that's
a good point. I mean, yeah, the way you put it that way, it kind of makes me think, like, sometimes I'll be, you know, the Sagebrush Inn in Thermopolis, Wyoming or something, and I'll look at the walls and there'll be copies of maybe some incredible artwork or something. but it takes a conscious effort to notice it because the decoration itself is just such a background to us.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point. Ricardo wants to know, of all of Tolkien's published works, is there one you like the most?
I really like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Deep cut.
It's such a cool story. But in Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings is classic.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I want to say Beowulf, but I'm still very cross that the translation of Beowulf is complete, but his commentary is not. I think his son couldn't decipher all of his handwriting, or the notes were lost. So and the commentary is so interesting on Beowulf. It's just when it stopped, I was like, "What? Wait, where's the rest of it?"
Right.
Sad.
I also, I admit when that came out, I also thought, oh, wow, so J.R.R. Tolkien is publishing the 50th Beowulf translation this year. It just competes with so many translations of Beowulf.
So if you're a fan of Beowulf, though, I've really got to recommend the newest translation by, Maria Headley?
I haven't seen it.
Oh my goodness. I love the gravitas of traditional translations, but her translation makes me excited about Beowulf. So I really encourage you to check it out. Anyone who's interested in Beowulf.
I've always preferred Dick Ringler's for being both very faithful to the original content and somehow duplicating the poetry in a way that doesn't sound ridiculous in modern English. It's a feat.
I imagine that's always trouble, an obstacle that translators have to overcome, especially if you're translating poetry, because you can have a sense of what they're saying. And it seems like you can either preserve the literal translation, or you can try and replicate the alliteration and the internal rhyme, or you can try and be faithful to what you think they were going towards. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that made sense.
No, it absolutely does, because
So something fun about Maria Headley's translation is it gets sort of the excitement. If this were being told in a mead hall, maybe it was very stately, maybe it was very portentous, maybe there were goosebumps being raised on the listeners because of how massive and stirring this was. And maybe it was also, bro, tell me we know how to speak of kings. Let me tell you about this guy Beowulf, because you will not believe the shit he did.
Sure. Which is kind of believable in terms of how stories get told today.
Yeah, right. There's got to be room for both, I think, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, that challenge. If you've ever looked at my translation of the Poetic Edda, I'm going more for what does it say story wise, and converting the poetry and what's poetry to me, modern free verse, right? And then you look at kind of the opposite tack is like a Hollander translation where it's trying to be poetically similar, but some of that literal translation gets sacrificed. And Ringler somehow kind of does both, and I don't fully comprehend his magic.
I also am a fan of Seamus Heaney. That's my go-to as well.
People like that one. It never blew my hair back, but I appreciate that he did. Lorianne asks, could you talk about Tolkien and how he borrowed names and places from the sagas?
Well, the first example that comes to mind is from the poem Voluspa, stanzas 10 through 16, Dvergatal, the catalog of dwarves. If you go through that, you see the names of lots of the dwarves in The Hobbit just plucked out. Eikin Skjaldi is mentioned there, and that's Norse for Oakenshield, so Thorin Oakenshield. Gandalfur is Wand Elf, which is a very appropriate kenning for a wizard. Let's see.
Although Thorin and Oakenshield are different in that list.
Different sections.
Yeah. I think it's kind of fun how we made that. What would that be, like an epithet of Thorin instead of a name? It's kind of cool.
Yeah. And the Icelanders did love their epithets. Kettle Flatnose, Aud the Deep-Minded, Eystein Falfart.
Yeah.
Straight from Landnama book.
And all the guys called Viga something. Yeah. The killer or the doer.
Yep. Killer Hrap. Probably not someone you want as a neighbor.
Probably not. I don't think uh, who was that? I guess it was Hulskulder's neighbor, right, in Loxville.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then one of the places, I'll see what you think about this. One of the places where Tolkien, when I read Tolkien, and it's been a while. Again, I'm not actually much of a fantasy reader or fan myself, but I have read the major Tolkien works some time ago. But one of the places where the Norse influence most stuck out to me was the story of Turin Turambar, which is part of the Silmarillion, but there's also a separate book published with an expanded version of that story. It's so indebted to Volsungs and the Kalevala, and he combines them in such an interesting way. Could you talk a little bit about that and the kind of the confluence of Norse and Finnish in his work?
Well, not with Turin Turambar, because it's been a while since I've read the Silmarillion, and as much as I'd like to have, I teach a class now on Tolkien's Nordic sources. I would love to have a part 2 that is Tolkien's Nordic sources in the Silmarillion. So I've reread the Lord of the Rings many times for each semester, but I haven't gone back to the Silmarillion, so I can't speak to Turin Turambar. But as far as Finnish influences in Lord of the Rings, what is really clear to me is Tom Bombadil.
Okay.
So if you're only familiar with the movies, then you're not going to know who Tom Bombadil is. But Tom Bombadil, I think, is directly inspired by the Finnish Kalevala hero Väinämöinen, because they're both the oldest being. They are oldest and fatherless. They are associated with nature. They have power and mastery over things through knowledge, not through dominance. And most importantly, they express their power, their magic, through singing. All the magic in the Kalevala creation happens through singing, and Tolkien borrowed that with his cosmology. So the Canto 4 and 5 of the Kalevala as the romance between Väinämöinen and this woman Aino. And it's not a happy story. Aino is given to Väinämöinen and kills herself rather than marry him. Yeah. So
it's a lot of that kind of thing in the Kalevala.
There is. Yeah, it's got a bit of a downer sometimes. But I think that if we're thinking of Tolkien as taking medieval Scandinavian material and then writing fanfic about it, improving the story, Tom Bombadil and Goldberry are Väinämöinen and Aino if they were given a happy ending. Because Tom Bombadil and Väinämöinen have the same characteristics. They're too similar for it to be an accident. And Goldberry, if you look at the imagery that describes her, it's all water imagery. Her shoes shine like fish's mail. The water lilies and reeds and water-side plants. So Goldberry is sort of this spirit of water. And if Väinämöinen and Aino had a happy ending, if they had loved each other, then they might have ended up like Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, who are so well suited to each other, they weave together a single dance.
That's cool. That's a deep cut there.
Oh, it's very exciting. I love it.
It's not as surface level as what I was thinking with Turin, where so much of that is indebted to
Kullervo? Or it's, it is Kullervo.
Yeah, Kullervo, but then mixed with Sigurd and the Volsungs.
I don't know. Tolkien loved the Kalevala to the extent that he taught himself Finnish to read it in the original.
Right.
Wow. And he really liked the story of Kullervo, which baffles me because it's a pretty dreadful story. It's a terrible tragedy.
Yeah. It's a story of terrible child abuse and the horrible person this abused child grows up to be. I mean, it's extremely dark.
It's very dark. And Väinämöinen at the end is like, don't rear your child crookedly. Don't let a stranger raise your child. So it's all a cautionary tale. Tolkien wrote the story of Kullervo, and it's a book that I haven't read yet because I kind of have to work myself up to reading Kullervo again. But he wrote his own version of the story, and someday I will compare it to the Kalevala source material and see, maybe learn better what so fascinated him about that particular narrative.
And so spinning off of this a little bit, because I'm curious to have you talk about this to a wider audience than just CU students. You have a class called Tolkien's Nordic Sources you teach at CU.
Yes.
Every year, I think, maybe every semester.
Every semester.
So what can you give us a kind of a précis of what you cover in this class?
Yes, I expand Nordic sources to also include Old English sources because, as far as Tolkien's borrowing from medieval Nordic societies to create world building and create people, there's a lot of overlap with Old English society and literature. So we talk about um, in the class we do a real crash course with Viking Age literature and society, Old English literature and society, so that we have a vocabulary. All right, honor was very important. Reputation was very important. You increased your reputation by doing battle and acting in such a way that people will want to sing songs about you. Hospitality is paramount. Reciprocity is paramount, whether you get good things or bad things. We revisit the Havamal a lot throughout the semester. So going through the Hobbit, there are more direct one-to-one parallels. For example, if you look at Smaug the dragon, um, very generally, Smaug the dragon is a combination of the dragon in Beowulf and Faufnir from the Saga of the Volsungs. But you can look more. We spent a whole day dissecting this more closely. What are specific things that Tolkien takes from Beowulf? What are specific things that he takes from Volsunga Saga? Where is there a layering, a weaving of both? Yeah, and then once we get into the Lord of the Rings, there are fewer like immediate one-to-one references, but the attitude, the attitude of hospitality is, I think, the Old Norse and the Old English would recognize it. Uh, the especially with the Rohirrim, the desire to fight alongside your lord, to avenge him if he dies, and to do deeds that are worthy of song. That's verbatim what some of the Rohirrim say, Eomer and Theoden. And the idea of needing revenge is something that in Volsunga Saga, it's oaths, broken oaths, and vengeance, right? Tolkien doesn't have a lot of that in Lord of the Rings. There's more of it in the Silmarillion material in the Second Age, and that's a tragedy. It's like this is a cautionary tale. Don't be so fixed on revenge that you let it destroy your society. Um, so I guess, and I apologize for the meandering. One of the threads throughout the semester is that Tolkien takes Norse and medieval ideas of heroism and changes them, because the Norse hero, the Beowulf, the Sigurd, is not a modern hero. Tolkien is exploring modern heroes. So where the Vikings and Sigurd and the characters in Volsunga Saga are very concerned with getting vengeance, that's not what you're supposed to do in Tolkien. At the very end of Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo says, "No, don't get vengeance because Saruman is being terrible." And he's done terrible things in the Shire, and a lot of hobbits want to kill him. But Frodo says, "No, don't. Revenge will profit you nothing." And here I imagine like Sigurd, like a record scratch. What did he just say?
Right.
Because that ethos of revenge was so intrinsic to Viking understanding of life, but not for Tolkien.
So is he modernizing these heroes, or is he Christianizing them? Or is that?
I would say modernizing more than Christianizing, because like I think of Boromir as a hero that is really in the mold of Old English and Old Norse sources. Devoted to his father, devoted to his family, having a very narrow idea of kingship and wanting the preservation of his society, but not really caring what's not taking it doesn't he doesn't take anyone's advice. He doesn't. The one major thing that Boromir doesn't accept about the ring is that only Sauron can use it. He thinks about his glory as much as he thinks about his responsibilities, and the seeking glory is very important to medieval Norse and Old English heroes. They seek glory to their own detriment. Boromir does as well. Boromir's the path the ring has to Boromir, to ensnare Boromir, is Boromir's ambition and his lust for he's desirous of greed. So, sorry, he's desirous of glory. So he's just like Beowulf. And what happens to Boromir? Boromir fails. He's redeemed, but he fails. He tries to take the ring from Frodo. He drives Frodo away. Turns out that's what needed to happen, but he didn't know that. And he dies knowing that he did wrong.
Right.
It is Christian, I think, that he tries to atone, right? He tries to atone, tries to protect Merry and Pippin, and he dies confessing to Aragorn and passing the responsibility onto Aragorn.
It's, yeah, like a somewhat, I don't know, you're making me think about the last few lines of Beowulf, where he's gotten himself into this dragon fight that he couldn't survive. And then we're told at the very end that he was the most desirous of glory. And are you looking for Beowulf?
Yeah, I've got my Tolkien translation here.
I might have a copy of Beowulf up here. I don't think I do, but that's something to that effect. It's like, is this a eulogy, or is this actually what got him in trouble?
I argue that it's so interesting. Yeah, he was ever of the kings of the earth, of men most generous, to men most gracious, to his people most tender, and for praise most eager. And lots of scholarly ink has been spilt over, as you say, whether that's praise or condemnation.
Right.
Because Beowulf he's got to be 80 years old. He's been king of the Geats for 50 years, so he's 80 when the dragon comes, and he says, "All right, I'm going to get an iron shield because wood's going to burn, but no one come with me. Watch my glory from over there. I'm the only person who's going to do this." And like he says specifically, "For the glory, I will do this alone." And good thing Wiglaf's there to help him a bit. Otherwise, he would have died. The dragon would keep rampaging. But we talk in class about whether Beowulf is a good king, because a king has responsibility to protect his people. What's going to happen when Beowulf dies? All their enemies, all their neighbors are going to invade.
Sure.
So would Beowulf had been a better king if he'd done what King Hrothgar had done in the beginning of Beowulf, which is, send out the bat signal for heroes. Like, hey, we've got a monster problem. I need a young hero to come save us. They're not equal situations, but the conversation is very worthwhile. What does it mean to be a good king to the Norse and to the Old English? You have to be generous. You have to provide your followers with opportunities to gain glory and honor. You need to protect them.
And the Beowulf poet highlights this a few times by saying, so-and-so, that was good king, right? That was a good king. I don't know if he says that about Beowulf, but I know he says it about some of the earlier kings in the text. I'd have to look. But then Tolkien's also...
that specific line about Beowulf.
He does say about Beowulf. Yeah. But Tolkien is clearly wrestling with the same question of what a good king is.
Yes.
And that's interesting. He's having a conversation in some ways with his old poets himself.
Absolutely. And that's what's so interesting. If someone, I get a little puffed up when someone says, like, this character is the hero of Lord of the Rings, because I think there isn't one hero. And I think Tolkien is trying to say that too. There isn't one way to be a hero. Think of the changing world that he was in. There needs to be another class on Tolkien and the World Wars, because I would love to take it. But the Great War changed everything. There was a way to be martial, a way to do war, and that was all swept away after the Great War, during the Great War. Lines we thought we wouldn't cross, we crossed. So I think Tolkien was thinking about his experiences in war and different ways to be a hero, and he took his beloved medieval sources where heroism was very clear, and maybe thought, what's a hero for the modern age? What's the heroes, the heroes are singular and paragons in classical European literature, in medieval European literature. They're often very similar, cut from the same cloth. They're God-touched. They are superfluous. They are the best at everything. But those aren't the heroes that we have. So Tolkien creates heroes to compare with those medieval heroes. Like Boromir is the Beowulf analog. Boromir fails. Well, who succeeds? The one who succeeds asks for help, listens to his elders, listens to lore, Boromir in the books often forgets lore, and that's red flag. very self-serving for the historian to say, listen to the old stories, listen to historians. But Gandalf does that too. Be kind to wanderers. So and Frodo even fails. So thence the argument, Sam is the real hero of the Lord of the Rings. Well, Sam is one of the real heroes of the Lord of the Rings.
But they each have different facets of the heroism needed for the modern age.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, because imagine Beowulf failing. Imagine Sigurd failing. Well, they do fail, and it's like it's tragic and dramatic. But Frodo fails, and he's still a hero. How? Because heroism is more than just success.
This is a good tie-in for the next question I see over here, which Ricardo asks, what about Tolkien's Middle-earth made you love it?
Well, the movies first. I was in high school when the movies came out, and those were great. And then I started reading Lord of the Rings, and I stopped halfway through the Two Towers because I was bored. So I think it was actually the reading that I did in medieval studies and reading more epic literature, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Aeneid, that gave me, and reading Old English poetry, Old English epics, that gave me a better appreciation and a better patience for Tolkien. I think if you do it right, reading Tolkien's sources alongside with Tolkien, you come out with a better appreciation for both of them. I began my class with this. There's a really tremendous irony in doing source criticism of Tolkien, because Tolkien hated source criticism, absolutely reviled it. He talks about this in the beginning of his lecture, Beowulf, the Monster and the Critics. And that's because his contemporaries working on Beowulf ignored things that couldn't possibly be historically accurate. So Grendel's mother, the dragon, nope, not a thing. We are going to mine Beowulf for as much information, historical information, on the Old English as we possibly can get. And Tolkien was like, no, this is art. This is poetry. You have to think of it as art first. You might be able to get historical information from it, but don't dismantle it. Don't tear apart the art just to find some nugget of historical information. Right. So I think Tolkien had been around improperly done, careless source criticism. Because if you do it correctly and appreciate the art for the art, and think of it as this is art and it may have been inspired by this, if you do it right, you can end up with a greater appreciation for both. And we've all been in a class where we've started with something that we've liked, a movie, a book that we've liked, and it's just been analyzed to death, and then we can't bear to look at it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's always a little fear that I have, especially when I first started teaching the class. Fortunately, I'm happy to report that no one has finished my class hating source criticism, because there's a way to do it judiciously and fairly.
Yeah, that makes me wonder if I made any students hate the eddas. It is something you worry about as an instructor, but I think I doubt it. I think people who came in indifferent stayed indifferent without coming to hate it. I'm going to focus.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I try to remind students to feel the wonder of it. Read the poems out loud. Always remember that you're reading this amazing piece of literature, and it's supposed to be fun. Let yourself be swept up with the emotions. Let yourself feel fear when there's a thrilling moment. Let yourself be relieved when, okay, we're safe now, or are we? Right? And it's very different than I am academic reading and it's all very serious. Like, remember that it's supposed to be fun. You can do that and also think critically about it.
Right, you can do both. It doesn't have to be choosing one or the other. Yeah. No, I appreciate you reminding people that. I'm going to focus on questions from people who have asked fewer or none so far here over on the side, because a few have piled up. So Rodman asked if either of us had read The Children of Hurin. I did, and that was what I was thinking about with the Turin story. Yeah. Yes. I actually think that's Tolkien's best stuff. It's the Silmarillion and that early, was that the first age, those stories.
He didn't write the Silmarillion as like a standalone book. The Silmarillion was assembled from decades of world building into a narrative.
Yeah, I've sometimes uncharitably suggested that was the phase of Christopher Tolkien's life where he began publishing every napkin his dad had ever written on.
Yeah. The Hobbit started on the back of an exam he was grading, and like, yeah, big mood.
I'm not far from the truth. Although, actually, I'll make a quick aside. One of my favorite books about Tolkien I've read, or by or about, was a biography of him. Mm-hmm. I think it was actually written pretty long ago, like in the 70s. But he has a really interesting life story for anybody who's interested in language and philology and such. It's interesting to read the story of arguably, not even arguably, certainly the best known philologist. Some sympathetic parts of his life and stuff I got. Phoenix asks, wasn't the story of Bilbo distracting the trolls until they turned into stone from a story about Thor? Yes.
So there's Alvismall, where Thor plays for time with this dwarf that wants to marry his daughter. But trolls turning to stone is a nod to general Scandinavian folklore.
And there's also in Helgakvi the Hjorvasonar, in the Poetic Edda, one of the Helgi poems, they keep a Jotun woman talking until the sun turns her into stone too. It's not a consistent feature of Jotuns or dwarves. It's just like when it's plot convenient, they are turned to stone by the sun.
Yeah, I noticed that in the Norse mythology, but it is a consistent characteristic of trolls in folklore. So I don't know. I guess I would assume that the mythology, the sun turns monster into stone, came from Norse mythology, or maybe it was always in folklore, even when Norse mythology was being practiced, there was always the folkloric undercurrent of baddies sometimes turned to stone in sunlight.
But I also think that we forget that there's no monster manual back then that says, vulnerabilities or something. It can end on story to story. And
yep, that is the frustrating thing about folklore. It's not consistent.
Yeah. Payson asks, does anyone else see what Tolkien did was repackaging our ancient lore in a modern format, a novel for a new generation to appreciate it? I can see that perspective. Would you think repackaging is an appropriate word, Avedan?
I think of repackaging as, I think Tolkien made so many changes to the source material and reassembled the pieces in different ways. So I think repackaging is not the word that I would use because it doesn't give Tolkien enough creative credit. This reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said about medieval authorship, and the scholar Fisher writes about this in an article called Tolkien Remaking, that a characteristic of medieval writers was that they would freely borrow from one another. There was no modern idea of intellectual property or plagiarism. They would just as cheerfully amend and edit and add to other people's material as their own. And Tolkien sort of does the same thing with other texts. It's not like he's saying, I've got the Saga of the Volsungs, I'm going to rewrite it in space. That I would call a repackaging. But instead, he's so immersed in the literature and the society and the values presented in literature. He's got this enormous just understanding of it. And then from that, he generated something new. His purpose behind making Middle Earth was to reassemble, was to rediscover the lost mythological origins of England. Mm-hmm. Right? So very much a romantic nationalist idea that our sense of self, our nationality comes from folk wisdom, except Britain didn't have one. King Arthur was too French, Robin Hood was too peasantish. So what was the lost mythology and mythological epic for England? And that's what Tolkien was, that's what was being revealed to Tolkien. Yeah, I think representing might be a better way of putting it. But also more to it than that. It's messier.
It's generally, I would say that's 90% of the time true. I think there are times where it's extremely unsubtle. I mean, the sword that was broken, that's given by the mother to the son. I mean, he might as well have just copied that out of the Saga of the Volsungs. He did just copy that out of the Saga. I mean, that's not very subtle. But no, I think you're putting that just right. And I think he actually somewhere wrote something almost exactly like what you just said. in one of his letters or one of his essays.
Certainly possible.
I'm going to ask you a question that was sent in to me earlier that gets us a little off topic, but I just want to make sure I'm getting it in.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Mosh asks if there was ever a Norse woman who fell in love with a slave in real life or in the Eddas, mythology, or folklore. So stories where, I guess, a Norse woman who's not a slave falls in love with a slave, and I cannot think of one. Can
No.
you? Yeah.
I can think of the other way around, like in Laxla Saga Hoskuld with Melkorka,
Yeah.
but then she turns out to be Irish royalty and not really
Right.
a slave.
Right. And there's all these notions of being really, high class or low class. These are such classist stories in a way, right? I mean, oh, you're not really a slave. You look too good, right?
Right. Right. You're too pretty to be a slave. You produce this exceptional, the superfluously amazing child, Olaf. Oh, of
Right.
course, no slave, no real slave would have done that.
Right. And still, if I've missed any of the questions that were sent in beforehand, let me know. But I don't think I have.
I don't have it on my shelf, so I'm looking at Stella, but there's a book called either The Keys of Middle Earth or The Keys to Middle Earth. That is an excellent. It has source material and also academic discussion of how Tolkien interacts with the source material. So if you're interested in this, that is a marvelous book to read.
Okay. Stitch asks, I noticed Tolkien uses a lot of intelligent animal species in The Hobbit: wolves, dwarves, eagles, birds. Is this his own input, or has this got some mythological origin?
I can't think of a mythological origin. What's in my sort of awareness that may have been an influence was, again, folklore, talking animals and animal helpers in folk stories. The very convenient eagles that will take you places, especially like eagles that will take you to the north wind. That's the only link I can think of.
The Saga of Arrowad has him carried by an eagle at one point, and he winds up in the eagle nest, which is kind of like that scene in The Hobbit.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's that. Writing the wargs kind of makes me think about the Jotun or witch women. Of course, the line between Jotun and witch is always kind of vague. Who ride wolves. And there's the one in the Helgi stories. It's also in Helgi the Hjorvarssonar, where the woman riding the wolf offers to ride with Heaven. Heaven says no, so she curses him to make a promise that night that he's going to regret. And then the one who shows up at Baldur's funeral.
Yeah.
So that could be a connection.
The writing wargs, for example, it's mentioned offhand in Tolkien. And Jackson made a bigger deal of it. Peter Jackson made a bigger deal of it in the movies.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Like he did with the love story, which isn't a huge part of the main narrative of Lord of the Rings, but I guess he's getting that out of like the appendices and then, other stuff like that.
My biggest beef with the movies, actually, I think that I understand why they did it, but I think the movies did a dreadful disservice to the characters of Boromir, Faramir, and Denethor. They're much more interesting and complex and sympathetic in the books.
You know what? I am in total agreement. When I read The Lord of the Rings like 2006, and I thought, I ought to see the movies now. Mm-hmm. And what disappointed me the most was Faramir, because I thought the cool thing about him was he's the normal mortal guy who can resist the ring. But then in the movie, he's just another guy who wants the ring.
No, yeah, it's just...
Yeah, that was too bad. I thought that, there's other things where I mostly got the adaptation. I mean, sure, mixing some of the stuff in the appendices is fine. Compress some events because Tolkien could go on.
Take out Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil does not add to the plot. Tom Bombadil adds to the mood and to the world building. And if you say that Tom Bombadil is irrelevant, I will fight you. But for a movie, it's a different medium. Of course, you're going to need to prioritize different things. Yeah.
I mean, I've thought about this too. Actually, one thing that I used to ask students in Sagas classes was I would, on tests, I would ask different students about different sagas, but I would say, take this saga and tell me what you would take out if you're making a movie about this for a modern audience, right? And I wouldn't tell them that question was there beforehand. I wanted to kind of see what their spontaneous answer was, because first of all, it would tell me they knew the saga. But second of all, I was kind of interested to see how they would contrast storytelling between the sagas and now. And one of the things that they always that was often noticed was they would take out like this part early in the saga where they just told everything that was going to happen later. Right? It's that medieval audience toward that medieval audience's attitude towards spoilers that's so different from ours. Right? Like they almost seem to be happy to see prophecies being fulfilled. We don't want the spoiler.
No.
Right? It's two different attitudes. But Tolkien has more of that modern attitude. You don't know how the Lord of the Rings is going to end. Right? You don't know that it's going to end with Frodo and Sam at Mount Doom and then riding on an eagle and Aragorn being. I mean, it's actually not particularly obvious at the beginning of the book that's how it's going to end. So that is a definite more modern characteristic to his writing, I would say.
I kind of wonder, there's probably a discussion to be had about what the difference is between foreshadowing and prophecy and spoilers. Because there's foreshadowing to, for example, what happens in the Shire, the Scouring of the Shire. There's foreshadowing in the books. And I'm thinking, like, with in so many of the sagas, a woman has a prophetic dream that the man in the dream willfully misinterprets. Like, as a reader, we know, no, obviously her dream is correct. Don't be an idiot. But he's like, no, I will do the really obvious thing that's going to get me killed because that dream is silly. So I wonder how the saga audience would have, if they would have seen it differently than we do. Because I read it and I like roll my eyes because haven't you read a saga before? You know what's going to happen.
Right. Yes. I've had a specific dream that indicates that I will be killed. I will not be killed. It's like, no, that's well.
Yeah. It's not even saying, well, the Norse attitude towards death is there's a time I'm fated to die. Nothing can change that. So if I'm going to die, I may as well be as badass as I can possibly be so that I'll have a good reputation. But it's just the denial. It's like, no, it's not a thing.
Well, and Stella puts it, Stella says, I've thought about that, and it really is kind of a medium thing. It's like seeing the killer slip into a room unseen when the protagonist doesn't know. But I think the audience back then is more invested in the journey as opposed to the destination than we are nowadays.
What a great way of putting it, yeah.
Ricardo wants to know if you've listened to the song of Baron and Luthien, sung by the artist Carlene.
No, I have not, but it's another thing that I've written down to look up later.
Okay.
There's so much great stuff inspired by Tolkien.
I mean, yeah. Not to mention all of this whole genre that wouldn't exist without him. Right. I mean, look at fantasy before him and look at fantasy after him. I mean, not only is he injecting so much of this older mythic and saga literature into our modern consciousness. I mean, I think in a lot of ways now, because of him, the sagas are more familiar to readers today than they would have been to readers in 1920.
Yeah. And also the notion that when you get to a place, you have to explain the history of the place. When you meet a person, you need to get the history of the person. Like that's stuff that was clearly, to me, inspired by the Icelandic sagas. But now it's sort of of course, we meet a character, we need to know their history. There is a backstory there, and we don't understand the story fully until we understand the backstory.
Right. Right, and the backstory may also include several generations in the sagas.
Yep.
Like Egil the first third. It's like
about his grandfather.
His grandfather.
It's important because it's the foreshadowing for the conflicts that Egil is going to have with the Norwegian kings and that Iceland has with Norway. So.
All right, so we're coming toward the end of about an hour and a half. Do you have closing thoughts you'd like to offer about Tolkien, about Tapestries, about Norse literature?
I think I will restate that if you love Tolkien, if you love the movies, or if you love Tolkien's work, then continue to enjoy that. It's okay for the movies and the books to be different, just the same as it's okay for Tolkien to have been inspired by elements in Beowulf and the Saga of the Volsungs and to have changed them. I think that there's a lot of creativity and a lot of fun thinking you can do by comparing sources to what they were, comparing sources to what they inspired.
Mhm.
And we've got resources in chat, and keep enjoying it and keep wondering about it.
I think it's well put. And actually, I'll tack onto that I think in a way Tolkien is continuing some of that medieval tradition of authorship. It's not plagiarism, but it's repurposing something older for a new generation, the same way the Sagas repurposed older stories for a new
Yes.
generation.
You update it to make it relevant to your current audience.
Right. It's modern saga telling.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Avedan, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to all my patrons.
This has been really fun.
It's always a good time. Lexi asked this way to save the chat box because the links, you can always come back to the same Crowdcast link to watch this video and look at the text box. So this does save if you have the link to the Crowdcast.
Cool.
All right, Avedan, thank you again, and we'll wish you all the best from beautiful Colorado.
Yep. Bye, everyone.